Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm Mike Horne, your host, and this podcast is for leaders and coaches who need and want fresh perspectives on what it means to live and to lead authentically. You're a leader who wants to make a difference, but sometimes you feel stuck. You know there's more to life and to leadership than what you're currently experiencing. It can be tough to figure out how to grow as a leader. You might be reading all the blogs and books, but it still feels like you're not making progress. You might even be feeling like you're doing everything wrong. On Authentic Change with Mike Horne, we interview experts who share their insights on how to live and lead authentically. Our guests are trendsetters in building great leaders, teams, and organizations. We provide fresh perspectives on what it means to live with purpose and authenticity. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast.
Welcome to this edition of Authentic Change with Mike Horne. I am absolutely delighted to have in the virtual studio today Eric Stone. And I want to tell you a little bit about Eric before we dig into this interview, in part about jumpstarting cultures, and we'll understand all of that in just a few moments. But Eric Stone has a passion for business, and this passion for business started early in life for him, and I'll let him tell that story as well. But it did lead him to a long and influential 26-year career at the iconic rental car company Enterprise Holdings, one of the largest privately held companies in North America. Eric began his career as a management trainee in 1992. I wonder if people still use those words, management trainee, in 1992, and quickly moved up the corporate ladder to become one of the most decorated regional vice presidents, RVPs, in the company's history. His ability to connect and motivate employees from all different generations and demographics allowed his teams to sustain top-level results and a culture of pride. Eric attributes much of this success to his ability to create, build, and sustain a high-performance culture. It was this culture that enabled Eric to lead his teams through challenging times, including 9/11, the Great Recession, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Great Resignation, and his ability to adapt to the unexpected and to help others to do the same became a hallmark of his management style. Eric retired from Enterprise in 2018 and founded ClearPath Ventures, which specializes in guiding young professionals and businesses as they navigate their path to success. From a community perspective, Eric has served on multiple boards in which he focuses on providing strategies and resources to close the opportunity gap for often marginalized groups in the state of Connecticut. Eric, I'm just so delighted again to welcome you. And why don't you say a few words about yourself to our audience?
That's great, Mike. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast, and thank you for the kind introduction. A little bit about my background. Listen, first of all, way back, I grew up, I was the smallest kid in my high school class and had to learn to be pretty quick on my feet being the smallest. Academics never came easy for me. Certainly learned some discipline along the way. And unfortunately, I would periodically get cut from those baseball teams and learned a little bit about resilience and grew up in a great family. Really got a lot from my mother, who was a teacher, and learned a lot about training and coaching. And my father, who was a textile salesman, who really helped me understand the importance of connection. And so I just had this thirst for business. I loved leadership. I loved understanding what organizations, teams do to create this sustained excellence, but this unique, special culture that's kind of put together where everyone is trying to achieve a common goal. Majored in business in college, and I land very lucky with an amazing company, starting entry level, one of four people in a location, and fortunate to climb the company ladder to eventually become an officer of the company and lead, instead of just being one of four, but being able to lead a few hundred. And so I've spent the last 30 years in business. I decided to start my own company as well. ClearPath, as you mentioned, and then really took all of these 30 years of practices and principles and came up with a message I wanted to get out. And instead of having a chance to help a few hundred people, I'm hoping I could impact tens of thousands of people with the message from the book.
That's great, Eric. And what's so One of the things that's so fascinating to me, and I'm sure to many in our audience, is that you describe this love of leadership at an early age. And I want to compare and contrast that with what you also described as sort of being the smallest kid, maybe taunted, bullied. I don't know if any of those things existed. But that wouldn't, in traditional ways that we think about leadership, give me pause to say, well, I love leadership. In fact, it might give me pause to say, let me go the other way and find a path. What was it for you?
Yeah, I guess when you're in that, and fortunately, I wasn't bullied, so that was
Great.
good. I was pretty quick on my feet. But I think what you learn is there are those who stand up for those who influence others and get people to do the right things, the right behaviors. And there was just this in between. The other stuff just gave me resilience and grit, and happened probably from my parents to really love the business aspect. Those things were just attributes that helped me probably get to where I was. But whether it was reading a book on a leader or watching my parents or other mentors, that was really what got me.
That's great. Talk about some of those mentors. I mean, who are one or two of them? You don't have to use a name, but I'm just curious.
Well, first, I really would go to family. I mean, were always there for me. Most parents would have probably said, Eric, when I was having some struggles, it doesn't look like you're super happy. You seem to be a little stressed out. Maybe you should hang it up. And they were quite the opposite. They were like, Eric, suck it up. It's your give a company a year or 2 years before you can truly make a decision and experience some of the things. And so would I have stayed the route? I don't know. And so I think my parents were really, really supportive. And then, of course, you use the networks within the company. And I could share a story of, I sign my name today, the way I sign it, because a branch manager I used to work for, and the way he taught me how to run a business. Every decision was explained. So instead of saying, hey, just do this, here was why we do this. And he would take me along on sales calls and let me join on certain meetings. And those were really, really important. And then a few others that when I was having a tough time, they were there for me and they would put things in perspective. And so there were a number of them. I think everyone has their own board of advisors or however you want to look at it. But I had a bunch and I actively tried to search that out.
Eric has a new book out called Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture. It's a roadmap for igniting high performance. What compelled you to want to get this message out to the world, Eric?
Being in business and competing with some really talented people within the corporate America, one thing I found is a lot of people have the same ideas, same core areas that you're trying to perform at a high level at. And yet there was something that I felt our team was doing a little bit different. There were so many other leaders who are much smarter than I was, who went to better schools than I did. Yet our team was able to come together. As they say, you may think you're the smartest person in the room, but you're never smarter than the room. And we were able to use the room and come up with a simple, consistent roadmap that was executed with pride at a high level. And we were fortunate enough to, on the rankings, surpass the peers. And so there was something there. And I realized that it was this corporate culture that we were able to demonstrate. And it really, to me, I look at culture as this catalyst to execution and getting a group of people to achieve the uncommon, unleashing people's true potential. And I felt I had something I could give to much more people. And so I wanted to take that into a practical roadmap that wasn't filled with big words and philosophical things, but a true practical roadmap that organizations and people who lead teams can use to demonstrate and engage their team.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so fun about your book, Eric, Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture, is the way it's put together. Just as the title, which was obscure to me as I started to read the book, what I love about it is how much and how succinctly you take all of these ideas from our experience with cars around taking test drives and minding who your passengers are and thinking about inspections. It's a really clever framework that you used in that regard. How did that come about? I mean, was it just sort of natural to you, or what were you thinking about?
Yeah, great question. For me, I wanted something to stick. I wanted something that people could follow. And I always felt a good metaphor allows people to follow you on a journey.
Uh-huh.
And so coming from a background of cars and knowing that building culture you cannot do in a day or 3 days, it is truly a journey. I decided to use a road trip and then use that all the way through the book, even from some, as you mentioned before we were taping, was, roadside attractions, the special little extra treats you're going to get along, or what's on the bumper sticker for some application for people.
That's great. And what are you finding in terms of getting your message out? I mean, and using that metaphor as a way of helping others?
It's interesting. The biggest thing I have found out is while I wrote the book for leadership, so senior leaders, HR professionals, those leading large teams, I happen to have 11 nieces and nephews who have also their own circles. And what I was pleasantly surprised that was resonating is the Generation Z audience, because those are individuals who really want to be part of a special culture, and it guides them how to do that. And so that's one of the surprises that I've actually got along the way when I originally was setting an intention of a higher level. But it became a little bit of a training ground in the earlier chapters to really create strong leadership attributes.
And people certainly can find out more about this, I'm sure, at ericdstone.com. They'll find ways to learn more about the roadmap and about jumpstarting cultures. What I'd like to explore a bit more with you is you talk about beginning with values. How did that work? I mean, how did you align your personal values with your company's values? What about people who didn't fit values? How did you select for values? It's a complicated, long question.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a few things. First of all, for me, up to the right of where I'm sitting are 21 principles I actually gave my kids that would guide them on their decisions throughout life. So someday if I'm not around or they can't get a hold of me, and I think that's the benefit. It's such an important beginning point. What do you stand for? And what are those values that you're trying to represent? And you represent them through your behaviors. And so to me, it was how you make your decisions. And it's such an important place to start. And it always starts there. It's like character. And so I think one of the other questions was, how do you look for that when you're hiring? It's almost like a character test. You can ask certainly behavioral questions that are big on competencies, but I really wanted people with special character, those who had that attitude, effort, and coachability, who would be adaptable to things. And so I had those who started the interview process, because we had a distinct process, to gather those bits of info. And I would really hone in on the character side of things. A small story was, frankly, what time someone would show up for the interview. And when they did, how did they interact with those around them? And I used to use my executive assistant, and no one knew it, but after the interview, I would say, how did the candidate treat you? When you introduced yourself, what did they say? Did they seem engaged? Some of these small, simple things. But to me, when you're in an interview, you're probably at your optimal. And so I was trying to learn in those interviews their typical. I wanted to know who they truly were. And it was a match. It wasn't just I'm looking for the best candidate. They're looking for an amazing company. And I've got to follow through with that too.
That's great. So let's say, we hire someone. How do certain businesses keep their employees engaged and avoid burnout through even the most challenging times?
I was really big on these simple factors of engagement that were, when you talked about values, those are big. You certainly don't want to list them. You got to quote unquote live them. But right next to those values was this philosophy of engagement that would be in our training room. And it was all about, so how do you get people to avoid burnout? Well, if you create strong relationships with your team and build initiatives from the beginning through their journey, that's one real important thing. If you supply them with the training, the proper development, the information and equipment, and to get that desired outcome, that's going to be very helpful. If you truly get to develop them personally and professionally, that's important. If you're very clear communicating your goals and expectations, that's important. And you want to be able to recognize and reward excellence. And when you package those together, the importance of the training one really overlaps a lot of them. And most people tend to get burnt out when they really are in an unknown. They get anxious, frustrated, disengaged when they don't know where they are, where they're standing, or they're getting no guidance. I truly believe people want to do really well. I don't think they show up in corporate America and want to be terrible. So I think those 5 factors were really important to implement. And for each one, there should be a few initiatives every organization should embrace that will avoid those difficult times. And we're all going to have them. The question is it truly burnout?
It's interesting. I wonder about a business like enterprise, and you can educate all of us. So often, people are promoted based on their technical skills. Somebody is really good at X, and that's why we have so many bad managers in the country, because we don't, hire for leadership. Rather, we, think about advancement as somebody's superiority with technical skills. How did that work in a company like Enterprise? And I've had some experience in those big systems when I led executive development at Marriott International and organization development in an industry where people could enter from many different pathways, starting as a lifeguard at a pool, at a resort, to, coming in from Harvard Business School to work in a strategy group. How did that all work out at Enterprise around selection for leadership?
It's not even just Enterprise. What do those great companies do to look for these leadership qualities? And I think you kind of said it right. Sometimes we tend to hire for competencies and fire for behavioral skills, and so they can miss the mark. And so one of the core areas has to be development. And what are you doing in order to develop a workforce, a diverse workforce, diversity of thought, ethnicity, whatever it may be? What are some of those things from a teamwork side of things that you're contributing? And that has to be part. The numbers will get you into an interview. And I think the great companies allow that to happen. I mean, numbers should matter. That's why you have them. And it tends to be the one that lands the interview is the one who can articulate it and almost bring another higher level of thinking and great examples of how they've developed people and future leaders. So it's not just about them, it's how they've developed more. And I think those great organizations reward and recognize those who are, quote unquote, what we would call culture carriers, those people who bring people through the organization.
Yeah, what does that mean, a culture carrier? How do you become one of those people?
So, and I got to give credit to Claude Silver, who I interviewed for the book of VaynerMedia. And she used a term of culture carrier, which are those, I think she even phrased those mini yous who are going to carry the message, carry the values, coach, train, develop others to pull through the company, create a deep bench for the organization so you can continue to, quote unquote, scale your organization. And so I know I personally would gather what I call the think tank, and every organization will have it. It's how do they run it? What do you do to bring in that think tank? For me, was the manager level. And I would bring them together to try to create culture carriers. And the rule was you have to be willing to push back. You have to you can't just say, yes, Eric, that's right. I need some polite disagreement. And a lot of our major strategies and key initiatives were from the manager level. And they would go reach out to their coworkers and try to gather information. They would be in charge of the agenda. And there's a dozen strategies we did that I just probably wouldn't have known if it wasn't for these carriers that I was trying to create, culture carriers. And within that, we would also do some extra coaching and development. And then we would rotate out of it. And when we bring in a few others, creating culture carriers.
And as there's clearly a relationship, I think, in my view, between employee experience and customer experience. How can companies continue to provide memorable customer experiences no matter what obstacles appear in the way?
The best story I have for this is a story about Johnny the Bagger. And what it is it's this ownership mentality and this empowerment that you allow your employees to have, where they feel that they, of course, are a big part of everything that's going on. And so Johnny the Bagger was this young man with actually had Down syndrome. And he listened to this inspiring speech from a consultant from a large supermarket chain. And that consultant said, every one of you can make a difference by putting your personal signature on every interaction. And so at that time, Johnny had no idea what to do. But he thought about it, and he reaches out and he calls the consultant and says, at first, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how I could make a difference. But I came up with an idea. And he would come home and day's work, he would come up with a thought of the day. And that was his way. So he would be bagging groceries. And as he handed the groceries over, there would be a thought of the day to the customers. And of course, what happens to Johnny's line is it gets super long and the manager comes in trying to triage that line. And the customers keep telling him, it's okay. I'm here to get Johnny's thought of the day. And it transformed into the floral department, where now those in the floral department wanted to do what Johnny was doing. Empowered, created an idea, ran with it, ownership mentality. And they would give unused corsages or flowers to young children, seniors who were walking around the store, and they would just pin it on them. And it just transformed. And so it is, what do you do to create that sort of mentality where you give the ability to solve some problems and you give the ability to be super creative and put their personal signature on it? And that creates engagement. And that usually leads to getting through those difficult times.
And Eric's book, Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture, a roadmap for igniting high performance, is out in October this year at the very beginning of the month. And, it's going to be available everywhere where books are sold. Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture. Eric, as I read the book, one of the things that I wondered was, how do some leaders continue to inspire high performance while optimizing profits, growth, and retention? And I guess some do not.
I think the way you do it is inevitably, as you go through business, where it's 2008 Great Recession, it's just of course, pandemic happens. It's creating a great resignation. Things will go wrong, number one. And you've got to hopefully create something so strong, and they believe, and I know authenticity is a big piece of what you're about as well. And you've got to create this belief that there's even more we're capable of. And so as I would develop training, if we're going to raise and sustain, it's what else are you going to supply your team that allows them to be great every day? Now, hopefully they're going to want to be great and they'll bring some ideas. And so to me, it was finding information that constantly would give them the ability to achieve the goal that they're trying to achieve. Their individual goals would hit the area goals, which eventually hit the region's goals, which help us hit the corporation's goals. But it was supplying information that kept it fresh, because a lot of times what happens is things get stale and you've got to uncover when that is. The other thing is just being able to get those initiatives as they come in through your entire organization. And so whatever that initiative is, does the 3-week employee have a little clarity like the 3-year employee, like the 30-year? And while they'll be a little bit different, is there awareness and understanding? And when people are getting great communication along the way, it tends to help allow you to push. And when I say push, I don't mean bad. You're trying to guide them to do things that they're not even realizing they can do. And so for me, it was supplying that bit of information. And as I mentioned, using folks through my think tank that really challenged us of what do we need to be ready for? Something usually is about to break at times, and you just want to be ready for it, no matter how good you are.
And in work on Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture, roadmap for igniting high performance by Eric D. Stone, one of the things you talk about is hitting the brakes on outdated methods. Can you provide some examples of that, please?
It could be a number of things. I know specifically, I could just use, maybe you have some sales training or technology that's now come, and you've got to The outdated is what used to happen. New technology comes in and you've got to get everyone up to speed on the new. And so you can't be mindful of that innovation and bringing in new technology because that's what keeps it fresh. And so whether it's sales material that we would always go searching for and looking for gaps. I mean, I think that was a big thing. What are the gaps out there that we're missing that could be perceived as outdated? And those little, we did one, and it was just about personality styles for our sales team. And we had a bunch of rebuttals for the common scenario, but we couldn't uncover certain personality styles. Specifically, that bold, assertive person who comes in and tries to just bully you around at times. And so you can't just stay with the same old, same old. That's not how you have sustained excellence. Doesn't mean you can't do it for a while, but you always got to be mindful of things that could be as outdated and having settings to review those. I'll give you another quick one would be reviews. I know a lot of companies have reviews. The reviews are so old and it doesn't let you bring in the new initiatives that come in. And so here you are trying to establish this uniqueness and you can't or you don't have a place for some of the new initiatives that you have been able to uncover. And so it just doesn't align sometimes. Just a couple of small examples.
And do you distinguish among or between types of performance, a lead performance, a peer performance? I'm just thinking about that in the context of performance ratings.
Expand on that one a little bit, Michael. I just want to make sure I understand.
So when we're thinking about performance, often there's a number or a letter or an assessment associated with performance. So are there different levels of performance and how do you think about those, particularly at higher levels of productivity or performance or relevance or meaning, whatever the measure is?
Well, I mean, as long as it's consistent, I mean, absolutely. Whatever your grading is, whether it's a 1 to 5, whether it's a meets, exceeds, whatever that level is, I think the biggest thing is what does it mean to meet? What are those key things that would be consistent along the ranking system? What does it mean to exceed or to be outstanding? And what are some of those numbers that would lead to an outstanding performance? And so to me, it's just really getting defined so you're having consistency.
Right. And in a big system like enterprise, I wonder about, consistency in leadership. And what do you think about consistency in leadership?
That's the goal of every leader, is to be unbelievably consistent, being mindful that someone in Oklahoma might do it slightly different. And so the reason people can embrace an initiative is when it's consistent. And so I think that's the challenge of everything, whatever your initiative is, a sales pitch, a service opportunity, whatever. If you're in marketing and branding and being consistent with the brand, that's what the great ones can do. And so I think to be consistent is one of the ultimate compliments. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and clearly that might show up. One of your chapters in this book is Follow Your Moral Compass. Can you talk more about that, about you're always on stage, making soup, listening to each other? Talk about these, how it's important for leaders or creating these engaging cultures for people to follow their moral compass. When people enter the workplace with a whole lot of different, morals and what's important to them. So how about if my moral compass is different from your moral compass?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is going to be slightly different. I think usually through the hiring process, that's the whole point of getting that right match. And I use match because match is competencies and the values kind of blended together. It's head and it's the heart. For me, that was my role. It was one of the biggest roles of however many founding values, whether I'm consulting or in my corporate career, is what am I doing to live those espoused values? For example, if giving back to the community is unbelievably important to support not only our business partners, but our employees, what am I personally doing to do that? And so my role, and I felt it was really important to do a lot within the community. And so I was on the board with the United Way. And then it's not just being on the board with the United Way, it might be running or leading a committee on the United Way. And then it's volunteering at a outing for those who are in need within the community. And so whatever your values are, it's truly, truly living them. If it's something about teamwork, it's what am I doing to bring my 9 departments together as one and avoid silos? And how do I do that? And what are some things that I can utilize those department heads to truly relate and make sure they feel part of what's going on with the field operators potentially? And so every one you've got to constantly circle back, and it should be something that you're reviewed on.
Yes, and how do we create these distinctions? I often wondered that when I was at Marriott, a company that essentially employed the working poor in many of its facilities. I assume that a lot of service businesses are employers of the same, and people have to have 2 jobs to survive or maybe more. How do we make paths for people to leadership who, start out at the most entry level positions in the organization?
I think one of the big steps goes to the development part of career mapping and staying close to your future stars and touching base with them a few times throughout the year, depending on your relationship with that individual, and really mapping out where they see them best serving the company and where you see that they might best be serving the company. And so you're always talking about what might be next. And so I think that's the simplest version of how can we hopefully the company has a number of different channels. So if you're a smaller company, it can be a challenge to like, what is next? Some of the bigger companies have the luxury that actually there are several different pathways you can go. And so through relationship building and one-on-one settings and reviews and mappings and mentors, those are all helpful to guide people to see where they're best going to serve as a leader, if they can make it to leadership. And we know not everyone is meant out to be a leader.
Well, and so many barriers to leadership. I mean, so many systemic barriers as well in organizations for advancement. Eric, as you think about jumpstarting your workplace culture, can these similar practices or same practices be employed in virtual environments as well as environments where people are required to show a physical presence? I know when I've led HR and science teams during the pandemic, we had to have everybody in the lab. I mean, it was essential for the advancement of research and the delivery of medicines to meet unmet medical needs. As how does your work relate to both virtual environments as well as environments where people need to be present?
Yeah, I think there are certain occupations and sectors that you're going to be required for the most part to come in. So any customer service, customer facing positions, it kind of makes it, you kind of have to be in there. The application and what I like about the book is that there just are some timeless principles, whether it's what me and you are doing right now, Mike, which is having a conversation and learning from each other. There's some value you can get. I will say, in my opinion, it is much more difficult. I look at board meetings that I try to go to, and now that I have a crutch that I might not have to drive an hour and something away, I might choose to be virtual. And I think those pose some challenges. I think we've got to continue to work our way to find out some best practices. But make no mistake, people just want to have a relationship with their manager. They want clear goals and expectations. They want some information to be developed. You got to know them personally and professionally, and you got to reward it. And you could do that virtually. Might look a little different or in person.
Eric, if we were to, we're going to wrap up in a few minutes. If you were to give our listeners some guidance or some, top reasons about really taking the principles in your book to heart, what would that advice or guidance be?
I think the simplest guidance that you could get from the book is an approach that you could follow. It's called the hourglass approach. If I were to give advice from the book, you can utilize that in so many different ways. And the quick version of it is when you think and envision an hourglass, not an eyeglass. Eyeglass is about I, hourglass is about our, we. Is at the top is that feedback section, stakeholders, customers, clients, board members, whoever it is, that you're constantly always searching for feedback. And as you get that feedback, you'll then notice the hourglass kind of comes out and in, the sand goes through. And as you're gathering, committing to all the information you've received, to the true commitments of what you're going to do, you're going to go right where that sand comes out, right at that spot. That's clarity. That's the message. And that's what you ideally want. And I want people to get is it doesn't have to be hard. It's right there. As that sand goes through, think outward now. Now you've got to reinforce that message through training and field presence or however virtually that you could do it to ensure people truly embrace it. And at the end, when the sand piles on the bottom, that's when you assess it. And that's when you'll look at your culture and measure it. And the crazy thing about culture is once you think you got it, you got to turn the hourglass over again because a new thing, a new problem, new technology, new something else comes in. And I think if I could get people to just think of an hourglass, I think that'd be a nice learning lesson from the book as well as the measurement.
Oh, that's great. And I assume that in your work at ClearPath Ventures, helping young professionals and businesses navigate their path to success, that would be a similar message, is to really focus on perhaps the hourglass and its relevance and application to leadership.
Absolutely. Hence the name Clear Path is, how can we try to, and I know it's hard, there's never a clear path, but how do you create a path that is clear, that allows you to truly focus where that sand goes through the hourglass and have utmost clarity? And that's what we're all searching for, that piece.
Well, it's great. It's so exciting with Eric's new book on workplace culture, available in October. It's Jumpstart Your Workplace Culture. And you can also find out more about Eric on LinkedIn at Eric-Stone-Clear-Path. But I think if you probably type in his name, you'll find him on LinkedIn that way. You find them on Instagram at ClearPath Ventures, on Facebook. Also, I'd suggest, entering search term ClearPath Ventures, entering Eric's name, and also visit on YouTube. But it's so exciting to be with Eric on this part of his author journey. And Eric, just thank you so much for being a guest on Authentic Change with Mike Horne.
Mike, it's been, the pleasure's been mine. I really appreciate all your thoughtful questions, the time you took to read the book. That's fantastic. And here's to everyone jumpstarting their workplace culture.
Great. And until the next episode of Authentic Change with Mike Horne, stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast. I'm delighted that you've tuned in to listen. Please visit the show notes for links to topics discussed in today's podcast. To download a free ebook on authentic change and leadership and to subscribe to my newsletter, please visit mike-horne.com. Once again, mike-horne.com, mike-horne.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast.